my opposer when I want freedom. You my opposer when I want justice. You my opposer when I want equality. You won't even stand up for me in America for my religious beliefs, and you want me to go somewhere and fight, but you won't even stand up for me in that home.
The FBA, or the so-called BA fighter, are held to a much, much, much higher standard. And that's the reality of the sport of boxing. I received a comment yesterday from an anti-black boxing fan, and this is what he left me. Now, usually I don't really get into what type of comments I receive in my comment section of my video, but I thought this comment was very interesting. Now, this particular anti-black boxing fan, he is struggling with pulling himself away from content that makes him complain. Now, this particular person only complains about, the FBA or so-called BA's opinions. Okay. Now, whether if we create content expressing our opinion or just leaving our opinion in the comment section of whatever video that there is, he complains about it. Now, with this particular anti-black boxing fan, nobody's telling him who he should celebrate. No one comes to his video and flood his comment section with a bunch of nonsense complaining about the fighters that he likes. Nobody cares. No one shows up and tell him that he shouldn't support this or that fighter. Nobody cares. Okay? If he believes that a certain fighter is the #1 pound for pound fighter, and if he believes that there are no black fighters that belongs on the pound for pound list, nobody cares. But he seems to not be able to not care about the foundational or so-called BA's opinion, because he's always in our comment sections trying to tell us what to think or what to say. Now, a couple of years ago, I was celebrating Gervonta Tank Davis, and I was told that, I shouldn't be celebrating Gervonta Tank Davis because he ain't beat nobody. Right? Gervonta Tank Davis. Now keep this comment that you see on your screen in mind. Just don't let this comment go. Keep this comment fresh in your mind. Okay? I talked about how Gervonta Tank Davis beat 4 undefeated fighters in a row. So the fighters that Gervonta Tank Davis fought had a combined record of 71 wins and 0 losses. Okay? All 4 fighters are well known within the boxing community. You can say that they're not stars. You can say that they're not well established, but they were respected fighters because majority of the fans here in this community then had conversations about them. Even if a person didn't create content about the sport, somebody in the comment section were having a conversation about these 4 fighters: Rolly Romero, Hector Luis Garcia, Ryan Garcia, and Frank Martin. These fighters were all talked about before Gervonta Tank Davis fought them. And not to mention, for about 3 years, Gervonta Tank Davis versus Ryan Garcia was in high demand, meaning that the world wanted that fight. So let's not forget that the boxing community was demanding for this fight between Tank and Ryan to happen. And it did. I understand people are trying to sweep that fight under the rug like it never happened. But that fight happened, and that was one of the biggest fights that the fans demanded for. But again, I was celebrating that. I was talking about how Tank, last 4 opponents were all undefeated. But this particular anti-black boxing fan did a response video, talking about how Tank fought nobodies and how he does not deserve any recognition for fighting 4 undefeated fighters in a row. And mind you, even he talked about Ryan, talked about Frank, talked about Hector Luis Garcia, and even talked about Rolly Romero. He was one of the guys that was accusing Gervonta Tank Davis of ducking Ryan Garcia. He was somewhat excited for Shakur Stevenson versus Frank Martin when that fight was being rumored. So he talked about these fighters before. But when I celebrated Tank for beating these fighters and how his last 4 opponents had a combined record of 71 wins, 0 losses, he took a crap on those fighters. He said these fighters were trash. These fighters were bums, right? So to him, competition mattered because he didn't see these fighters as being competition. He completely brushed them off because Tank beat them. Now, when you look at this comment, he's celebrating Junto. Junto's last, 3 fights or 3 opponents has a combined record of 58 wins, no losses. And he's celebrating, that for Junto. But however, he has never talked about any of those fighters that Junto just beat. Interesting, isn't it? But with Tank, the names matter. But with Junto, the names never matter. And this is why I say, ladies and gentlemen, the FBA or so-called BA fighter are held to a different standard, even though the standard should be the same across the board. But the reality is that it's not. These FBA fighters are judged by who they fight and who they beat. One loss can ruin their whole entire career. We see how people try to ruin Devin Haney's career when he got cheated against Ryan. So we know that when it comes to these FBA fighters, they are held to a much higher standard. They don't really have a second chance. If they lose one time, it's going to be very hard for them to bounce back. Not saying that they can't, but it's going to be difficult because they're going to keep getting reminded that they lost. You see how people are reminding Devin that he lost to a cheater? That is the sad reality. Okay, these FBA fighters are held to a much higher standard. The competition matters. But with these foreign fighters, competition never ever matters. For him to write this nonsense in my comment section is a bit hypocritical of him to do that. For him to come in my comment section and write this is very hypocritical. This guy and many other like him despises, and I mean literally despises, the foundational Black American fighter. This is why they catch the most hell, the most disrespect, and the most criticized. For anyone that supports the Junto Nakatanis and the Golovkins of the world are walking hypocrites, because they are the ones that sit up there and talk about how Tank don't fight nobody, how Tank needs to fight someone, how Tank needs to do this and Tank needs to do that. But it's never a need for the Juntos and the Kenshiro of the world to do something. But when they're called to do something by other groups of fans, then those groups of fans are viewed as hateful, racist. When a fan like me demands for Junto and Kenshiro to fight someone with a name at least, we're called hateful. We're called racist. But they can sit there all day long and nitpick the crap out of these foundational Black American fighters' resume. But to them, they're just keeping it real. They're being a real fan. By them only slandering, discrediting, and disrespecting the FBA or so-called BA fighter, they're only being a real fan. They're only keeping it real. But won't allow anybody to do what they do to foundational Black American fighters or so-called BA fighters to their favorite fighters. They won't allow it. Because again, this comment here is hypocritical. He should not be celebrating Junto Nakatani at all, because Junto Nakatani don't have a resume. Junto Nakatani's last 3 opponents have a combined record of 58 wins, no losses. But Tank Davis, before he fought Lamont Roach, last 4 opponents had a combined record of 71 wins with 0 losses. And one of the fights was one of the biggest fights of that year and one of the highest grossing fights in boxing history. So Tank versus Ryan was a fight before it happened that was in high demands. But Gervonta didn't get any credit for beating Ryan Garcia on top of beating Frank Martin. Roy Romero, Hector Luis Garcia, Ryan Garcia, and Frank Martin. Those are the fighters that Tank beat. They were all undefeated. So he fought 4 undefeated fighters in a row. And he got 0 credit for it. But this guy want to come here and try to shine some light on Junto Nakatani for beating 3 undefeated fighters in a row. But he has never talked about any of the fighters that Junto Nakatani beat. None of them. Sure, he may talk about them when Junto is scheduled to fight them, but prior to Junto being scheduled to fight them, he never talks about the fighters that Junto Nakatani's fought and beaten. Ever. But he sure had many conversations about Ryan. He sure talked about Frank Martin. He sure talked about Hector Luis Garcia. And he for sure talked about Rolly Romero. Make it make sense, ladies and gentlemen.